Hi, I'm Judy Cole, the Executive Vice President and CEO of the MIT Alumni Association, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this web production of the MIT Alumni Association.
Hello and welcome everyone to the Faculty Forum Online. This is a program of the MIT Alumni Association. My name is Nate Nickerson. I'm the Vice President for Communications at MIT, and I'll serve as moderator. And today's program will go from now until 12:45, which is 45 minutes from now. Technical note, for alumni who wish to ask a question, you should enter your first name, location, and your question in the form that's on your screen. We'll try to get to as many of those as possible. Our guest today is Institute Professor Ron Rivest. And Professor Rivest, thanks for taking time to do this.
Thank you.
So Professor Rivest is a member of MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab, known as CSAIL, and specifically its Theory of Computation group. He is a founder of CSAIL's Cryptography and Information Security group, and he is acclaimed for his contributions to the RSA public key crypto system. This system secures communications between computers using products of large prime numbers, and as many of you know, Rivest is the R in RSA. Among many honors, Professor Rivest received the Turing Award in 2002, which, as you know, is the highest honor in the field. And in 2010, Professor Rivest earned MIT's James R. Killian Jr. Faculty Achievement Award. And it was this summer that Professor Rivest was named an Institute Professor. So in preparing for today's discussion, I asked Chancellor Eric Grimson to tell me what he would say to all of you if he bumped into you at a cocktail party and you said, oh, I'm going to have a conversation with Ron Rivest. So I want to tell you what Eric told me, and I will embarrass Professor Rivest by saying this. Eric said to me, that's easy. I would tell them that Ron is the most humble, brilliant thinker you will ever meet. Now, I recognize the irony in saying that is that all your humility is now gone if Eric Grimson says that about you. So look, we're going to jump into your questions in a moment, but I've got a couple right off the bat. So let's start with this one. Professor, if you can walk us through briefly what RSA does and why it's important, I think that would be helpful.
Thanks, Nate. Thanks for the kind words, and thanks to Eric, I guess, too, for his kind words. It's a pleasure to be here. I've never done one of these before, and hello to all of my friends and colleagues out in cyberspace there that are watching in. I wish I could see you as well as you can see me. The question was about RSA. RSA was a crypto system that we developed here at MIT back in the 70s. S is for Adi Shamir, and A is for Lynn Edelman, and they were members of the mathematics department at the time. And the stimulus for the work was a beautiful paper written by Diffie and Hellman on public key cryptography, the idea of public key cryptography, which they didn't know how to implement. And so our proposal was the first, and it turned out to be an enduring proposal for how to implement public key cryptography. The idea being that everybody would have a public key, so you would have a public key, Nate, and I could encrypt email to you using your public key, and then you could decrypt it using your knowledge of the secret key. And you mentioned prime numbers before. Prime numbers play a key role in the RSA, and they play a key role in lots of cryptographic schemes, although, in fact, modern cryptography has been moving away from number theoretic basis a bit. And so the idea is you would publish a product of two large prime numbers, and I can use that to encrypt a message to you, and you can use the knowledge of the prime factors themselves to decrypt. So the details I can get into if you like, but that's the essence of the idea. The difficulty for the adversary is essentially that of factoring the product that you publish into the prime numbers. And if the adversary can't do that, then they can't read your email.
Okay, good. I think if folks out there have more specific questions about RSA, just send them in. We can ask them, but I think that's a good overview for now. So, Professor, tell us a little bit about what we're seeing in the news about kind of notions from the government about having backdoors.
That's a great question, Nate. Yeah, so there's always been this tension between some of the missions that the government has and some of the academic research. Even back to the early days of RSA, one of the first things that happened after Diffie and Hellman published their paper and proposed presenting at an IEEE conference in October of 1978, I think it was. And they received a letter from a fellow who worked at the NSA saying you'd be in violation of the export regulations if you publish this work. It's certainly been clear that the ability of private citizens and individuals to encrypt things could interfere with both intelligence gathering and law enforcement, and that debate has been going on since then. I think recently it's bubbled up again. We thought it was sort of over in the 90s. The government had proposed at that time a clipper chip to be installed in all computers and devices that send encrypted email. And that was abandoned finally as being unworkable. More recently, the FBI has been pushing for ability to access devices that have encrypted content or access the plain text of encrypted communications. And that makes sense from their viewpoint. They've got a mission to do, and getting access to that information could help them do what they do. However, it's my personal opinion and that of many colleagues that trying to implement such a scheme just opens Pandora's box into a whole host of vulnerabilities and difficulties, and it's not really a feasible thing.
So tell us, if we were to open Pandora's box, what are 2 or 3 things inside of that box that are really bad?
Well, for example, I mean, the goal here was be for U.S. Agencies to have access to encrypted content. Mm-hmm. But once you put a backdoor in, these are corporations, Google, Facebook, and so on, are international corporations. Mm-hmm. Every other government in the world is going to want similar access. So you're not going to have the U.S. government with a backdoor key. You're going to have the British with a backdoor key. You're going to have the Israelis with a backdoor key. You're going to have the Iranians with a backdoor key, and eventually have the North Koreans with a backdoor key. And
Right.
we don't want to go there.
Right.
So that's one issue. Mm-hmm. Encryption is a fundamental tool of technology these days. Every communication that goes over the internet should be encrypted. Many are, not all are, more should be. But you're getting into the innards of every device and every communication when you start to talk about policy like that. The complexity is mind-boggling. It just sort of says, we take all of our digital infrastructure and we redesign it all to put backdoors in everywhere, and that just is infeasible from a technical point of view. So it's just way too complicated. Security comes from simplicity, and this would not be a simple thing. It would be probably the most complicated security mechanism man has ever conceived of.
Well, okay. So let me ask you a really basic, but I think common question, and see if you have any insight on this at all. And it's going to be kind of vague, mm-hmm. Okay? But for folks out there, what about cloud computing is on your mind? For the average sort of user, but I'm not talking about governments. Mm-hmm. I'm not talking about heavy-duty corporate security. I'm talking about my family photos in the cloud. Is this just great and I shouldn't worry, or should I be terribly worried, or somewhere in between? I
think it depends on your mental choice about how much do you care about the privacy of your family photos and so on too, right? I mean, I think I use some of the cloud services. I put stuff there that is moderately private, but wouldn't be a disaster if some of that became public either. So it's a risk choice for everybody. There's certainly risk anytime you use a computer, anytime you connect to the internet, and all of us live with a certain amount of risk in what we do. And I think people making individual decisions for themselves and the family probably can be more comfortable with a certain amount of risk than a government agency like OPM or whatever, who certainly had a recent disaster with all the personnel records they managed. So I think it's a question of how valuable is the data. I think for most individuals, the primary question is not confidentiality. Yep. It's reliability. Do you back up your data? Are your photos backed up? Right. You don't want to lose all of them. Right. Interesting. It'd be a different, that's a much more serious problem than having them, posted on somewhere. Huh. Got it. So I want to get to, before we start getting to questions from out there, can you tell us, because I have only a dim understanding of this, what your work has been and is around voting? Yeah, thank you. That's been a very interesting area of research for me since 2000, when we had the presidential election that nearly melted down the country. And I'm hoping we won't have that again in 2016, but we never know. There was a nice report that came out of the Brennan Center based on work done at Verified Voting too, that says that a lot of the machines now are pretty old and subject to catastrophic failure of various sorts. So I'm hoping the election will go smoothly, but we'll see. It's going to be a very interesting, both politically and technically. there. The work I do on voting is concerned about basically that, trying to ensure that the election outcome that is announced is in fact the correct one, that the winner is really the winner, that the voters elected him the winner, and that you've got evidence to prove it. I mean, I think an election should not just produce the outcome, it should produce evidence that that outcome is correct. So you have, for example, paper ballots that have been verified by the voter, saying that this is really how I voted, and they can check it before they deposit it. You've got ways of auditing the collection of paper ballots or the various electronic records that get produced to do this. So there's a variety of tools that we now have for doing audits, post-election audits, and doing verification of the outcome that are really quite interesting. And voting is challenging. It's hard because you need to separate the identity of the voter from his vote. You don't want to have it posted anywhere. This is how you voted, Nate. Otherwise, you'd start selling your vote and things like this. So you need to, on the one hand, separate the voter from his vote, which makes it different than banking. A lot of people say, why can't I, why isn't it just like banking? We can just sort of solve all this with some online system. It's very different. And you need to make it disconnected. On the other hand, you need to make sure that that disconnection operation maintains the integrity of the vote, and you have a ability to check the votes that are, that they're really what you cast, even though you can't prove it to anybody else how you cast. So it's we use cryptography for some of these techniques. We use statistics for others. There's a variety of tools that allow us to confirm that the outcome is the correct one. It's really what the voters chose. And there's a variety of very interesting things happening in the world of voting now. I might point out, for example, the work in Austin, Texas, which has got a new system design out called StarVote. It's a combination of some of these cryptographic techniques plus paper ballots and statistical techniques. Really quite interesting, and I wish them success in moving forward with that project.
So I would imagine with work on voting, so you're looking at it from the point of view of a computer scientist, but it has to be that within a couple of hours of any discussion, it starts to get into social issues of what you're really trying to do, right? Because by making voting digital, you kind of massively increase participation or the possibility of that, right?
Most of that's a common hypothesis, that improving technology will improve turnout or something like that. By and large, that seems to be false.
Oh no!
Right. I mean, so there's little evidence that supports that going digital improves things. In fact, there was some evidence in Hawaii that it goes the other way. That making it online or something like that could improve turnout. Mostly, I mean, it seems that most voters are either one of three types. Either they're committed voters, they go and vote no matter what the technology is.
Yep.
They're committed people who don't care, and they're never going to show up no matter what the thing is. And there's 1 or 2% who will show up if the weather's sunny and they don't have something else to do. So the amount of benefit you get in terms of turnout from changing the technology is not large, and it's not a major reason why one should change technologies, I think, and dive into the tar pit of complexity and internet voting and high-tech stuff, which looks glitzy, but as we see every day, has so many security problems. You don't need to go there with voting. Paper ballots work fine.
Got it. So I'm going to plow ahead with my questions until some of you out there, and there are many of you out there, have a question. So I'm interested to know what fields your PhD students go into, and whether there's been a change in this over years, or what's interesting about what you're seeing from alumni.
So I think the theory group as a whole, produces students who are good at security, at algorithms, at analysis of efficiency, looking at different computational models, producing models of various situations, a lot of probability-based models, a lot of, these days, big data models, working with distributed computing and so on too. So the theory group has a broad spectrum of interests, and our students go off into either academia or industry, working at Google or something like that. I've had students do PhD theses on encryption techniques and voting techniques and other security techniques, and many of them end up, say, in academia.
Yep.
It's common.
Has there been a shift over years in what folks are really interested in doing when they leave here, or is it just that range?
I think more for the undergraduates than for the graduate students. I think for the graduate students, the model has stayed more stable.
Yeah.
And although postdocs are becoming a little more common than they were.
Yeah.
But graduate student academia versus an industry research lab. I mean, the character of the industry research labs has changed. You've got AT&T, Bell Labs in the old days, and nowadays you've got Google or
Yeah.
something like that, or academia. But undergraduates see a much richer spectrum of opportunities, I think, than they used to.
Yeah.
And you know, the industry is really booming, and many of them are exploring startups or looking at, you know, things that were recently startups like Google or
Sure.
Facebook. Yeah.
Okay, so your thank you, folks. Your digital questions are filtering in the analog way, just as good as paper voting. So Richard in Singapore asks, how secure is HTTP or SSL in keeping snoopers away or governments?
So HTTP, HTTPS, SSL is you know, a complicated protocol,
Yeah.
and it, like anything that's complicated, it has bugs that are being found as we speak and continually being improved. So it provides a reasonably high fence. You know, whether it's absolute, probably not, right? I mean, there's just bugs that are found every few months, it seems. But you know, I think the right attitude is, you know, security is a matter of building fences, and there's always a question as to how high the fence is. It's not a question of building a fence that goes up to infinity. You just make it more difficult for the adversary,
Yep.
and somebody will, with enough effort, find a way around the fence or find a way of corrupting the fence builder or you know,
Yeah.
something like this. So it's certainly a trustworthy tool. I recommend its use,
Yeah.
but you know, don't expect perfection necessarily. You keep an eye out for patches and updates and improvements.
Okay, so SC in Washington asks the following. So how do we secure the data generated by the Internet of Things?
That's a great question.
And if you want to give folks who may not be familiar with that term a kind of a down and dirty description of what the understanding of the Internet of Things
Yeah,
is.
so my understanding of the Internet of Things is that you've wiring everything to the internet, and even small gadgets and devices, your toaster or whatever. Why you want to do this is up to you, I suppose, but everybody seems to be jumping on that bandwagon. Maybe it'll be fun, maybe it'll be useful. But you have the issue that the computers the chips that you're attaching to these devices may be fairly underpowered and not capable of much cryptography. That's changing. The chips are getting better, and you know, we're able to do more. But one of the issues that you face is the technical question as to how do you secure it, because the cryptography that you can do is pretty minimal on these chips. And my personal take on this is that every such device, and we talked about this back when we had Project Oxygen at our lab back in the 90s, even before a lot of this became quite real, was to have the chip have a proxy server somewhere. So each chip is pretty minimal, but it's got a secure channel to a server run by the owner or the manufacturer or somewhere. And so then that more powerful computer can act on the chip's behalf, so that you don't need to put all the smarts, you don't need to put all the cryptography, you don't need to put everything into the device itself, into your toaster. Your toaster has a software agent somewhere that speaks for it on the internet and will filter requests or you know, authenticate commands and so on. So I think that's the right architecture for most of these things. So that would be my approach. So don't try to put everything into the device itself. Your chip is not going to be able to handle what's needed if it's got to do some fancy public key crypto maybe, but just have a secure channel to a proxy.
Okay, here's a here's a big question, and it comes from James in Seattle. So I'll be fascinated to see how you even approach this one. So the question is, you know, that the good guys these days in cryptography, call it, or data security, always seem to be behind the bad guys. So first of all, do you agree with that? And what do you make of kind of good guy, bad guy? But then, you know, to the degree that you find something in that, James asks, when will we catch up? And of course, maybe the answer is never.
Yeah, great question. So that's one of the nice things about cryptography. There always is a sort of game theoretic aspect to it. There's the good guys and the bad guys, and you can sort of view it as a game, and some of the formalizations actually take that a bit further and really look at it more carefully from a game theoretic viewpoint.
Yeah.
So, you know, we're building systems at such a horrendous rate. I mean, every day there's millions of lines of code being written across the country and around the world. And every 1,000 lines of code you can expect there's going to be a bug or so. And so we're introducing bugs at a terrific rate as well. So as long as we're doing that, the game's not over. And in fact, the game keeps continuing, and the bad guys will say, well, there's a new system that was announced last month, and we'll start poking at it and running fuzz tests on it and doing things, and they'll start finding problems with it. So, I think that this game will continue for a long time, and people will keep poking holes in new systems. We're getting better at designing the tools for doing the crypto, for the cryptographic algorithms are getting better. We're getting better at the software tools for developing secure coding. So these add expense to the development process, but you've got an expense if you get broken into too, so it's probably better up front to design your system with a lot of care. But I don't expect this game to be over for a long time. And the question of playing catch up is often that the good guys are in reactive mode. They're saying, oh, we got broken into, and they find out how they were broken into, and then they patch it. So that's a game that's definitely reactive, and you're always playing catch up in that mode.
Well, so this question actually reminds me a lot of a conversation. I don't remember with whom I had it, but it was someone in the CSAIL, and I was asking something really similar to what James is asking, which is, what do you make of this kind of cat and mouse game? And the person I was talking to said something which I guess is sort of obvious, but it kind of struck me as being interesting was, well, you got to take a step back and ask, what's really going on in that scenario? You've got sort of a target, if you will, and just a lot of really motivated people banging on it and banging on it and banging on it. So it's just it's not the right metaphor. Isn't sort of like a sporting competition where each side is trying to do the same to the other side. They're each playing completely different games. They have different motivations. Is that part of this? Yeah,
that's absolutely part of it. Yeah. You have a worldwide playground, if you will, where you can pick targets anywhere on the planet and try to log into their systems or break what they're doing and so on too. So it's there are people everywhere who are trying to break into Google or Facebook or any U.S.-based corporations, and some of them succeed. So it's a planetary game. There are many adversaries out there, and we just need to keep beefing up what we do, both for good system design as well as monitoring to see when things get broken into, because things will break. Things will get broken into, and you have to keep an eye onto what's going on. You could have all your intellectual property stolen out from under you without knowing what's going on unless you have good monitoring.
Right. Okay. So let's take a question from someone so close to home that he's basically here. This is Aaron in Cambridge, who asks the following, and I think I understand the question, but I think you certainly will, Professor. So the question is, what techniques are being used to combat against increasing computing power that can more easily crack traditional security?
Great question.
And can you reframe it?
So most cryptographic techniques are based on computational difficulty. So the adversary who's trying to break in needs to search a key space or solve some hard problem to figure out how to read the traffic or to break in to authenticate themselves. And most of these schemes have what's called a security parameter, which may be a key length. They might say 128 bits or 256 bits, which sets the difficulty level for the adversary, that and the design of the algorithm itself. So typically you have a situation where you can control the difficulty for the adversary, assuming that your assumptions are correct and your algorithm doesn't have any unforeseen backdoors or cracks in it. So merely increasing the size of things. I'll take RSA, for example. When we first published RSA back in the 70s, we thought that maybe a 300-bit key would be enough, the product of 250-bit primes. These days, the NSA is recommending keys that are 10 times that as a protection against possible advances in quantum computation, which may be on the horizon. So 3,000-bit keys. And so by just increasing the sizes of the keys used, you can provide very substantial protection against these kinds of attacks that come by with additional computing power. Computing power is sort of linear in how much you spend. The difficulty for the adversary is exponential in the size of these key lengths typically. So you can easily scale things up so that you can outrun his advances in computing power. So the challenge for these cryptographic designs is not so much that you need to defeat predictable advances in hardware capability or scaling up of the hardware, but rather new algorithmic techniques. Maybe with the exception of quantum computing, which is not only a new kind of computing, but enables new kinds of algorithms as well. And should quantum computing really come into reality as a feasible engineering possibility, things like RSA would become unusable because there are good algorithms on quantum computers for breaking RSA due to people like Peter Shor, who's here at MIT.
So I'm going to return to the questions that are coming in, but I want to ask one, and this is I think I can promise this will be the kind of broadest, vaguest question that you get today. Okay, it's a question I kind of have for a lot of faculty at the Institute. It kind of goes like this. A lot of work in general is just reactive. The day comes upon you, and you're just trying to kind of keep your day kind of moving. But there come days, and maybe they're few and far between, where you have the kind of mental equivalent of a blank sheet of paper and some time and a good cup of coffee, where you can kind of answer for yourself the following sort of a question, which is, and this is you talking to yourself, right? Look, the main question in cryptography right now going forward, the thing I'm really thinking about, most generally speaking, is along this avenue. Is there something that broad that keeps your attention?
I think that looking at security frameworks of importance is what drives the field a lot. People in cryptography often say, what are the applications out there that people care about? Because there's lots and lots of mathematical questions you could look at too, investigation of old historical schemes or variants. Sometimes those are interesting and pay off well too, but a lot of the cryptography papers that you'll see are motivated, they have a storyline with them. They say, Alice has a medical database, she wants to store that medical database on the cloud, she wants to do searches on that database, she doesn't trust the cloud provider, she wants, so can you solve problems like that? And so the application scenarios are what drive the formulation of a lot of the cryptographic problems. And it's given rise to lots of wonderful recent developments. There's lots of work now by Vinod Vaikuntanathan and Shafi Goldwasser and many others on computing on encrypted data. So you're able to give somebody encrypted data, you're able to ask them to compute on it, which is kind of a strange thing, without decrypting, so they can take encrypted data and produce encrypted answers without ever knowing what they're doing. And this turns out to be just the right thing for these kinds of cloud computing scenarios. So people look at applications, they say, what am I trying to do? What can't I do? Why can't I get this done? And you find new formulations of problems happening by the applications. And so that's sometimes there are more abstract questions about computability and computing with different models. I mean, we have for example, the interesting question as to what can you really do with a quantum computer should you be able to build one? And people like Scott Aronson are looking at the computational complexity questions arising from quantum computation. And that's sort of a more abstract formulation, doesn't have a particular application in mind.
Right.
But many of the crypto things really do arise from applications.
Yeah, got it. Okay, great. All right, so we have a question. I think this is a really interesting one from Bill in Maryland. So Bill asks, in your opinion, are the most secretive American initiatives absolutely secure from adversarial spying?
I don't have any security clearances, so if you're asking me what the government really is capable of protecting well and so on too, all I know is what I read in the newspapers. Yeah. But what you can read in the newspapers is telling too, right? There's State Department gets broken into, the head of the NSA says, we assume routinely that our networks are compromised and things like this. So I do presume that, with a lot of effort and care, that our most carefully guarded secrets are in fact kept secure, but there's lots of places where things fall apart too.
Yep, got it. A question about whether you can talk about what's called multi-tenant cloud security.
So, I mean, the issue there is you've got several tenants running on the same CPU even, and they may be adversarial, and you may have leakage of information between one process and another that are running there. So you may be able to, for example, extract a cryptographic key from process A by process B, who is able to measure, say, the time that certain cache fetches take and so on. So other technical sensors that they have available on the chip itself. And those are real concerns. Those are difficult to protect against. If you really have very high value data that you want to protect, you want to know that your process is running on a dedicated CPU and there's nobody else sharing it who might be adversarial with you, or just bring it in-house. Don't run on the cloud at all.
Okay, got it. How about a Bitcoin question? Is that all right?
Yeah, no, I'm actually spending time on digital currency stuff these days.
All right,
and have in the past too. So.
Okay, good. So John in New York asks the following. John says, wouldn't the adoption of blockchains for global finance create a real risk of a future financial scandal? And if you can kind of break apart that question and help folks understand what John's asking though.
Yeah, I don't know what he has in mind. Bitcoin is a very interesting development. It has as a key feature this blockchain idea, which basically is a decentralized public ledger. So anybody can publish transactions. If they have Bitcoins, they can publish their Bitcoin transactions onto this ledger, and it's maintained by a collection of miners working around the world to extend this blockchain. So it's a public ledger. Having a public ledger, I don't see as being something which is that risky. I mean, if the crypto breaks, you'd have a problem, I suppose, but I'm not terribly worried about that. It's a consensus protocol, so there's time for things to settle down. So I'm not quite sure what he's referring to. There's lots of fascinating questions about digital currencies and blockchains. You get into gaming issues about, if you solve a block, when should you release it? There's some nice work by some fellows at Cornell that talk about those kinds of game aspects. I think it's just the whole field is bubbling up with interesting ideas and possibilities there. So I expect we'll see lots more in that thing. There'll be scandals. I think most of the scandals that happen have to do with mismanagement of the cryptographic keys that are used to either protect their own Bitcoins or protect those of their customers, or just straight out embezzlement.
Yeah.
So there's a trust issue involved there, even though the decentralized character of the Bitcoin blockchain says you don't necessarily need to trust any third parties to maintain these records. So I'm not sure what John is concerned about in terms of scandals. There could be, there always can be scandals as long as you have people managing other people's money, I suppose, and that's a lot of what we see.
That's not going to go away.
So we may live in a moneyless society someday.
So we've talked a bunch about security, and so this next question is about privacy. So I want to ask it. It's a specific question, but I would also invite you to talk about privacy as opposed to security, if any thoughts occur to you. So the question from Sonora Needham is this: how do you think Europe's battles with Facebook over privacy are going to pan out?
So first, let me set the context. When you talk about security, I think the first thing to talk about is what your security objectives are. It could be confidentiality, or it could be integrity of various sorts, and privacy could be certainly one of your security goals. So I see privacy as a piece of the larger security framework. The European concern with privacy, what's been happening with Google and Microsoft and Facebook recently, is fascinating to watch. I can't predict how it's going to come out. I really don't know. I think that there's a definite back and forth negotiation that's going to have to take place. The U.S. has been very lax about allowing companies to push data around, personal data, in a way that the Europeans are increasingly concerned about, particularly given the Snowden revelations.
Sure.
So I don't know where to predict. I think that there's a lot of interesting discussions to have there. I think one of the organizations that I work with, I'm on the advisory board of, is the Electronic Privacy Information Center. They've got a great website which talks about a lot of these kinds of issues and how the privacy landscape keeps evolving. And I would recommend people interested in that to go look there for further information.
Got it. Now this is, I'm really glad this question came in from Los Angeles. I'm not seeing a name here, but great. So the person writing in asks you to talk about your own intellectual property, what you do with it, and if you could sort of answer the question, why should young innovators trust the public domain over filing patents. How do you think that through, and what's been your history with that?
I think it depends. So RSA was patented by MIT, and then the patent expired quite a while ago now. And that was helpful in getting the RSA, the company, up and going. So that's one data point I have in terms of that. I think these days things are moving fast. Keeping things as trade secrets and just moving quickly to get stuff on the market is a way to go if you're developing software. It depends on the technology. If you're trying to do something which has networking effects, digital currency is one of those good examples. People aren't going to trust typically closed source solutions, so you'll need to have if it's software that everybody's going to be using on their own computers to do something for them. They may very much prefer an open source situation where they can look at the code at least and look at it. I know Stallman would say it should be free too, until that you're not having to pay somebody for the software. But I think that openness is much more the thing today. It's hard to tell. I mean, Facebook, you can see it both ways. Facebook has essentially closed source. It's not open source product, and so they had tremendous success. They keep working on it. On the other hand, things like Bitcoin, Linux, and so on are entirely open source. So we see it cut both ways. If you're an entrepreneur with an idea that you want to push out there, you could try to encapsulate it in some intellectual property. Maybe your investors would demand that you do so. Maybe they would demand that you do the opposite. I think it really depends on the kind of market you're trying to address.
Okay, so this we have a question from Renee in Austin, Texas, and it's a big one and a good one. So here goes. At what point do existing approaches to defending private property become prohibitively costly? Does the internet ever get to a point where it is too costly to do business safely?
So I don't know what kind of cost you're talking about. There's cost in defending yourself against. So I'm not sure what intellectual property you mean. If you're talking about private data sets, or if you've got IP that's in a research lab that you're trying to protect against Chinese hackers getting in or something like this.
Well, let's take the case of let's take a possible example of this line of question. Right? It was you're a retailer.
Yep.
And you've got millions and millions of customer records.
Yes.
And oh boy, isn't that a big responsibility? And how do you deal with that?
So, that's not my forte. I don't deal with retail things so much. But I think that there are best practices. There are. The banks are the ones who have spend the most. I think about 15% of their IT budget is spent on security. So if you take that as a benchmark, a typical retailer would probably expect to be spending a little less than that, 5 or 10% on security throughout. So if those numbers were getting up to 30, 40%, you'd probably say it was too much or something. But a lot of businesses today have to do their business online. Many of them outsource their sales effort to companies like Amazon that can put the staff together to maintain a highly secure site. So I think many of the mom and pop stores are just terrible at security, and it's too much for them. So.
Okay. So I'm going to go back to a couple of my questions while we get a few more. So this is going back to the back door, but it's going to quote some remarks you made about that. So at this spring's RSA conference, and in a report published this summer, you warned against allowing the government a regular access route into Americans' data on personal devices. You said that it would create, quote, a house with many, many doors with keys held by many, many parties, and that it would stifle innovation. And I think we covered the kind of first part of that question, but the stifling of innovation, I wonder if you could say a couple words about that.
Yeah, I think that you're talking about a situation prospectively where you've established a legal requirement that companies doing any sort of communication or storing any kind of digital data would have to get their data protection techniques approved or certified by the government before they could sell them, because they would have to say, well, now can the FBI get into this, or can the FBI get into that? So you invent a new menu app for looking at your menus of your local restaurants, and all of a sudden you're having encrypted communication for that. Perhaps you're storing a password for a user who wants to log in frequently. So now, but now this software needs to be certified somehow or approved. What's the approval process going to be? Is there 3 million apps on the Google iPhone and the Android App Store, something like that. So every one of those, would prospectively have to be approved somehow by some government agent, who would have to say, this is okay, it meets our backdoor access for law enforcement.
Right.
That's just unworkable in my viewpoint.
Yeah. Got it. Okay, so a couple of folks have asked about the RC4 cipher.
Yeah.
So tell us about what that is and what
Sure.
what has been changing about it.
That's been an interesting story too. RC4, there's a whole series of RC things that I've worked on. Ron's code, whatever. Some of them never got published. So RC4 was one I did in 1987. It's a stream cipher. It was proprietary for a while, part of the product line that RSA had as a company, and eventually became public. It was ARC4 for a while. Alleged RC4, but it's about 6 lines of code. It's very simple and quite fast, and it's been used widely in lots of products now. There's no patent on it, so once it was out there, it was analyzed by other people and seemed pretty robust and usable for a long time. Recently, however, people have continued to look at the security of it. It's had known statistical irregularities for a while. And those have become better studied, and attacks on RC4 have gotten more powerful, partly because we know the statistics better, partly because the computing power of the adversaries are getting better, partly because the kind of protocols where RC4 was used allow repeated attacks quickly over a period of time. So it's an interesting cipher. I would now say it's time to retire RC4. I agree with those who are saying it's shown enough weakness now. As they say, crypto systems never get stronger; they only get weaker.
So what's next?
I have a proposal with Jacob Schultz, who was one of the attackers on RC4, for a redesign of RC4, taking into account of what we did. The new design is called Spritz. It's on my website if you want to look at the details there. It's like RC4. Basically, we asked the question is, if we had undertaken the RC4 type design today with what we know today about the statistical issues and so on, what would it be like? And so that's a redesign. So it's a bit slower, it's much more secure, and it's out there for people to look at now. There's many good crypto algorithms out there too, so it's in a landscape where there's lots of good standards. And in particular, the US government has been doing a very interesting job of having contests for encryption standards and adopting algorithms which may not even be designed by Americans as US national standards. So it's been an interesting development to watch.
So can we shift? We mentioned quantum computing earlier, and I want to return to it, if that's all right. Okay. So Bill from Maryland asks that, how important it is to be the first nation to utilize quantum computing.
So there's quantum computing for the purposes of quantum computing itself, for general computation. And for that, I think the question is still open as to what kind of problems you can solve quickly on a quantum computer, what kinds of things can we really do faster with a quantum computer than a classical computer. Ironically, it seems that really the best thing that a quantum computer can be put to use on is breaking RSA. And once you've got a quantum computer, nobody's going to be using RSA anymore, so what's the point? So we have that kind of situation. But it's a fascinating theoretical question as to what quantum computation is good for. I wouldn't be surprised if 40 years from now their quantum computation is quite feasible. I think it's a long process. It's going to take a long time to figure out the engineering aspects of that. It's a challenge like that of fusion power or something like that. So it's a.
So we have 2 minutes left, Professor. So I'm going to ask an old journalist question, which is, what did you wish I was going to ask you?
I had no idea what you were going to ask me. I think you've asked a lot of great questions here. talking about, we talked about encryption policy, we talked about RC4 and RSA, we've talked about voting. So there's a lot of things that are dear to my heart, and I think those are great questions. Things that you didn't ask, I don't know, those are great questions. Good,
Thanks to our alumni. Okay, so we'll stop there. To all of you out there, on behalf of the MIT Alumni Association, I want to thank you for being with us, and Professor, I want to thank you for your insights.
Thank you, Nate.
So to those of you out there, we encourage you to continue discussing these topics on the blog Slice of MIT and on Twitter using the hashtag MIT Faculty. You can also view an archive of this and past faculty forums online by visiting the Learn section on the Alumni Association website. So please join us next month for another faculty forum online. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks again for joining us. For more information on future MIT Alumni Association productions, please visit our website.